So the Arizona Cardinals 2022 season has been an unmitigated disaster. Off the field drama, coaches getting fired for inappropriate conduct, claims of tensions behind the scenes, and most importantly, just really bad play. Like really bad. I've been a Cardinals fan since they moved to Arizona, and this is one of the toughest seasons I've ever endured. And I've been through the seasons where we started Max Hall at quarterback. I went through the 2018 season, and part of what makes this season so tough is because the expectations were higher. We have an exciting quarterback. The team made the playoffs last year. Yes, we saw how that ended, I know. We have some exciting playmakers on offense and defense. Yeah, there were some questions and concerns going into the season, but there were reasons to be optimistic, but it all fell apart. So at this point, like many fans, I've given up any hope for this season being anything other than a wash. In fact, I kind of thought 2 weeks ago that this season was over. And like most fans, I think a lot of changes need to happen for this team to be successful next year. So in this video, I'm gonna talk about what I would do if it were me running the Cardinals. I know it's easy to say that, I'm just some dude at home, but for what it's worth, this is what I would do if it was me making the decision. So let me get this out of the way right from the start. I do think it's time for a change in terms of the general manager and the head coach. I don't think this is all on Cliff Kingsbury, and Keim's been up and down in terms of his moves. I'm not as down on them as some people are, but it really does feel like this organization needs a reset, a fresh start. So we're going to start with moving on from the general manager and the head coach. Now, in terms of replacing Steve Keim, I would say let's give Adrian Wilson a shot at the job. He's worked his way up through the organization, and I think he's earned a shot. Now, in terms of the head coach, I know a lot of fans want Sean Payton to be the next coach. Keep in mind, though, that he was under contract with the Saints and retired. That means that for the Cardinals or anyone else to hire Sean Payton, they would need to offer trade compensation to the Saints. The rumor is that the Saints want multiple first-round picks in exchange for Sean Payton. Now, I don't know if it would end up being that much compensation, but I could easily see it taking at least one first-round pick. For me, although I would like Sean Payton as a coach, I don't think I want to go in that direction. I'm actually going to go with an up-and-coming NFL coordinator. There are two coordinators I'm going to target for interviews. Shane Steichen from the Philadelphia Eagles and D'Amico Ryans from the San Francisco 49ers. Now with D'Amico Ryans, you'd be going with a defensive-minded head coach. So the idea there would be to build an elite defense and then let your playmakers on offense work under an offensive coordinator. Now with Shane Steichen, you're going with an offensive head coach. And the thing that I like about Steichen is that he built an offense around Jalen Hurts, a quarterback in Philadelphia who has similar traits as Kyler Murray. With what he's done in Philadelphia, I would love to see what he could do with Kyler Murray in this offense. Now that we've got the front office moves out of the way, I want to talk about what's going to be the focus of this video. And that's how I am fixing this roster. Now, before we get into the moves, I want to outline my priorities and assumptions and how I'm going to approach this. In my years as a fan of the Cardinals and following the NFL, I've paid attention to how teams build their rosters. And I think there's some best practices for how you do that. And those are going to inform how I approach this. So, my priorities and assumptions are as follows. First, this is not a full rebuild. The Cardinals roster needs a lot of work in a couple specific areas, but there's also a lot of talent here. You're not tearing this roster down and rebuilding it. It's a retool of certain areas. Second, you're gonna have to ride or die with Kyler Murray. I know there's some people who say that the Cardinals should trade him or release him, but that's absolutely ridiculous. If for no other reason, because of that massive contract. Trying to move on from Kyler Murray at this point would result in a massive dead cap hit and actually result in negative cap space. Now let me be clear, I am a believer in Kyler Murray's talent. I've been a defender of him for a long time, and I'm going to build around him. This point is more just for anyone who thinks the Cardinals should move on from him. That's just not realistic. You have to find a way to win with it. If you can't, it's going to be a couple years before you can realistically move on. Next, the offensive line is the top priority. In my opinion, that is the biggest issue on this roster. Now, the offensive line dealt with a lot of injuries, and if they were healthy, I don't think the offensive line would have been terribly bad. But that's part of the problem. Between aging veterans and players with injury histories, they just haven't been able to keep everyone healthy. So finding a way to rebuild this offensive line with younger talent and with depth is going to be the top priority. Improving the defense is the next priority. Now, again, there are some nice players on the defensive side of the ball, but there are some places where this defense needs an infusion of talent and depth. In my opinion, if you can fix the offensive line and improve the defense to even a middle of the pack defense, this team is a playoff contender. So the defense is going to be that next priority. Next, I want to balance winning in 2023 with long-term roster building. I want to make moves that fix the roster in 2023 without sacrificing long-term success. And I do believe there is ways to do this. My next assumption is that going all in on high-priced free agents is not a winning strategy. I know a lot of fans wanted the Cardinals to do this. The big splash signings are exciting, but often those big splashes don't work out. Now, this doesn't mean you ignore free agency. The point here is you have to be smart and strategic about those free agent signings. Sometimes that involves signing a big-name free agent, but often it involves signing solid veterans on good value deals. My next assumption is that this roster needs to get younger. The organization has put too much stock in aging veterans. Yes, you want some veterans on the roster to help mentor the younger players, but if you want to build a team that can win long-term, you have to draft, develop, and play younger players. And this ties into my next point. Young players need a path to earning snaps and or starting jobs. Now, some of this isn't how you approach free agency. If you're drafting young players that you hope will develop into starters, and then signing a bunch of veterans who are going to play in front of them, that makes it difficult for them to see the field. Now, it can be tricky to balance this because you do need to bring in some free agents, but you also want to develop those players. And I've got some ideas when I get to free agency and how I'm going to do that. My final priority is to use a value-based drafting strategy. I know everyone talks about best player available, but if you look at the way the draft has played out historically, there are certain positions that are better values at certain points in the draft. For example, as much as I love Xavier Collins and Isaiah Simmons, drafting middle linebackers in the first round is not a good value. You can find good linebackers on day 2 and 3. Same goes for running backs. But when you're looking at positions like cornerback and offensive tackle, first round is a good place to get those. So my approach to the draft is going to be taking into account these kinds of value-based strategies. Now that I've laid out my priorities and assumptions, I'm going to go through the roster position by position and identify the players I'm going to bring back and those that I'm going to let walk. Now, as I go through this, I'm going to look at players who are currently on the roster, players who are on injured reserve, and a few key players who are on the practice squad. I'm going to identify players who are going to be priorities to re-sign, players who I'll re-sign if the price is right, players I'm not going to re-sign, and players who I'm okay bringing back into training camp so they can try to compete for a spot, but I'm not going to pay them anything more than a veteran's minimum. So let's start with the quarterback. Going into 2023, the Cardinals have Kyler Murray and Colt McCoy under contract, and Trace McSorley is a free agent. Obviously, I'm going to bring back Kyler Murray, and I'm going to keep Colt McCoy around. I think he's done a good job as a backup, and I think he's a good mentor for Kyler. As far as Trace McSorley goes, he's one of those players I'm going to bring into camp, but I'm not going to give him a big contract, and I am going to bring in some competition. Next, we get to running backs. Currently under contract going into next year are James Conner and Keontae Ingram, and the free agents include Darrell Williams, who's currently injured, Corey Clement, who was recently signed to the roster, and then on the practice squad, they have Tyson Williams, who I think is worth mentioning. As far as Darrell Williams goes, when he was healthy, he played reasonably well, and he has a track record of playing well in this league. I'd be willing to bring back Darrell Williams to have a veteran presence in the room as long as the contract isn't too pricey. Now, for Tyson Williams and Corey Clement, I'm going to bring them into camp and give them a chance to compete for the roster, again, as long as I'm not paying more than a veteran's minimum. Now, when we look at wide receiver, this one gets a little bit more tricky. DeAndre Hopkins, Marquise Brown, Rondale Moore, and Robbie Anderson are technically under contract. And then free agents include Greg Dortch, AJ Green, Antoine Wesley, and then I've included a couple practice squad players, Andre Bocelli and Farrell Cooper, who've played for the Cardinals in regular season games this year. But when you look at Robbie Anderson, he has a $12 million cap number in 2023. And there's no dead cap hit for releasing him. Based on this number, you have to cut Robbie Anderson. His production does not justify a $12 million cap hit. So although he is technically under contract, he is a player who's going to be released. Now, he hasn't played well since the Cardinals traded for him, but he is a veteran who has a 1,000-yard season under his belt. If he's willing to re-sign for a modest deal, I would bring him back, but I'm certainly not bringing him back at $12 million. Now, with the rest of the free agents, Greg Dortch is a player who I'm going to prioritize bringing back. Every time the Cardinals have given him a chance to play, he has played well. To me, at minimum, you need him as an insurance policy because Rondale Moore is so frequently hurt. But I think he deserves to be more than just that. I think he deserves to be a part of the receiver rotation. Either way, I am prioritizing bringing back Greg Dortch. Now, AJ Green has been a good mentor to the receivers, and I know they love him in the building, but I think it's time to move on from him and get some younger players in the rotation. Now, unfortunately, Antoine Wesley obviously has dealt with injuries all season, but I would be willing to bring him back for depth under a modest contract. And then with Andre Baccellia and Farrah Cooper, I'd bring them into camp, but again, not on a big contract. Next, we have tight end. Under contract is Zach Ertz and Trey McBride, and then the free agents include Steven Anderson, Max Williams on the practice squad, and Bernard Seikovits, who's also on the practice squad. Now, Max Williams has dealt with injuries throughout the season, but when he's been healthy, he's been a very good player for this team. And I'm bringing him back as that third tight end on the regular roster. Steven Anderson hasn't played particularly well, and I'm not going to bring him back. And Bernard Seikovits is part of that special international program that the NFL has. And as part of that program, he actually has an exemption so the Cardinals can have an extra player on the practice squad. So I'm going to bring him into camp with the idea that he's likely going to end up on the practice squad with that exemption. But if he makes enough progress and earns a spot on the roster, that'd be great. Now we get to the offensive line. And this is the place where a lot of work needs to be done. So under contract, we have DJ Humphries, Josh Jones, Lacita Smith, Marquise Hayes, and Rodney Hudson. But Rodney Hudson is a concern here. Going into the season, they weren't sure if he was going to play, and then he decided to play, but has been injured and missed a lot of games. In fact, in his time with Arizona, Hudson has only played in 17 of 30 possible games, including the playoff game last year. That's 56.7% of games. He's barely played in over half of the games since he's been here. Rodney Hudson is a great center, one of the best players at his position over the last decade or so. But the problem is, if you're going into the season expecting him to be your center, and then he doesn't play, you are starting a backup center like Billy Price. While Hudson may be better than a lot of the other options out there, if you're only going to have him half the time, you're better off finding a center who might not be as good as Hudson, but is better than your backup and is going to be there every game. So if I'm running the team, I'm moving on from Rodney Hudson. I'm going to cut him. And that's if he doesn't retire first. Either way, I'm moving on from Rodney Hudson. So then we get to the free agents, and there's quite a few on this list. Now, Kelvin Beachum and Justin Pugh are tough because they've been good players for this team. Beachum has been the only offensive lineman who's been healthy all year, and Justin Pugh's been a solid guard for this team before getting injured. But as part of that youth movement, I'm going to move on from both of these players. I'm going to give Josh Jones a chance to play at right tackle, and I'm going to find someone else to start instead of Justin Pugh at guard. Now, the only player on this list that for me is a priority to re-sign is Will Hernandez. Prior to getting injured, he played well for the Cardinals this year, and I want to see what he can continue to do. I don't think he's going to be terribly expensive, but I think he's going to be a solid player for this team. One other player that I'm going to look to bring back is Joshua Miles. Now, he's injured right now, but he's a tackle that they've been developing for a number of years. He's not likely to be terribly expensive to sign, and he's a depth player I'd like to continue to have on the roster. But there are a couple other players that I am going to move on from. Max Garcia and Sean Harlan. Both have struggled when asked to play center for this team, and they're both probably better suited as guards, but neither of them has been particularly good. Now, Cody Ford, Billy Price, and Wyatt Davis are all high draft picks who have struggled in the NFL. So based on the traits that got them drafted that high, I think it's worth bringing them into camp and seeing if they can compete for a backup spot, but I'm not making any more of a commitment to them than that. Now, Rashad Coward is a veteran, not necessarily someone who I want to build around, but again, I'll bring him to camp and give him a chance to compete for the roster or maybe be part of that practice squad. Next is the interior defensive line. Now, the Cardinals only have two players under contract going into next year, Rashard Lawrence and Lecky Fotu. And their free agents at the position include Zach Allen, JJ Watt, Tristan Hill, Jonathan Ledbetter, and then I'm including Antoine Woods, who's been on the practice squad and is currently injured. Now, for me, Zach Allen is a priority to re-sign. He's had a breakout season, and he's been one of the most consistent players on this defense. Now, JJ Watt is a tough one for me. I would like to have him back. He's played well, and he's a great mentor to this defense, but I'm not sure if he's going to be back next year. With the health scare he had and the fact that he's got a new baby, I think he might retire. So if the price is right and he wants to play, I'd love to have him back, but at this point, I'm not betting on him being part of the roster next year. Tristan Hill's another player I'm going to bring back if the price isn't prohibitive. He's a former day 2 pick that was waived by the Dallas Cowboys, and I think he could be a solid backup at defensive tackle. Now, Ledbetter and Antoine Woods are players who I'm going to bring back to camp and give them a chance to compete for a spot. They may end up on the practice squad, but I do want to bring them back at least for that. Next, we get to outside linebacker. Going into next season, the Cardinals have Marcus Golden, Dennis Gardeck, Victor Dimukeje, Cameron Thomas, and Myjai Sanders under contract. The only free agent here is Jesse Luketa, and that's because he was cut put on the practice squad and then signed from the practice squad. And for Luketa, he's a guy I'm going to bring back as long as the price isn't too high, which I don't think it's going to be. Next up is middle linebackers. Currently under contract are Zaven Collins and Isaiah Simmons. The free agents are Nick Vigil, Ben Neiman, Tanner Vallejo, Ezekiel Turner, and Kamu Grugier-Hill. Now, when you look at these players, Ben Neiman and Ezekiel Turner have actually played pretty well. Now, Nick Vigil's been injured most of the year, but he was playing very poorly when he was healthy. Tanner Vallejo has struggled, though they do use him a lot on special teams. And Kamu Grugier-Hill was having a really bad season when he was cut from the Texans. Since joining the Cardinals, he's played primarily on special teams, but he is a player who has been a starting linebacker in the league before. So based on what I've seen from these players, I'm going to move on from Nick Vigil. He didn't end up being what the Cardinals had hoped he would be, and I'm not going to bring him back for another go. I am, however, going to bring back Ben Neiman and Ezekiel Turner as long as neither of them command a really high salary, which again, I wouldn't expect they would. Turner has been a special team standout for the Cardinals for years, and Neiman's a guy that they brought in as a free agent late in camp who's played reasonably well this year, and I think he could be a decent backup for this team. Now with Vallejo and Grugier-Hill, I'm okay bringing them back to training camp, but I think they're going to be a long shot to make the roster. Next up is cornerbacks. Currently under contract are Marco Wilson and rookie Christian Matthew. The free agents include Byron Murphy Jr., Antonio Hamilton, and Trayvon Mullen. Now for me, Byron Murphy Jr. and Antonio Hamilton are both priorities to re-sign. Murphy's had an outstanding season, although he has missed some games due to injury, and Hamilton has been a really good player for this team since they picked him up last season. Now Trayvon Mullen is someone the Cardinals traded for late in the preseason. He hasn't played a lot this season, but as long as the contract isn't prohibitive, I'd be fine with bringing him back. Next up is safety. The Cardinals have 3 safeties under contract going into next season: Buda Baker, Jalen Thompson, and rookie Tay Daly, who's actually injured right now. Their free agents are Chris Banjo and Charles Washington. Now, Banjo and Washington has been with this team for a number of years, and they're both special team standouts who've played reasonably well when called upon. I'm fine with bringing them back to camp, and they might end up on the practice squad, but they're solid players to have around, so I don't mind bringing them back again. Next is special teams. All 3 of the Cardinals special teamers are free agents: Matt Prater, Andy Lee, and Aaron Brewer. And with all 3 of these players, I'd look to bring them back. Andy Lee might retire. He's been playing forever. And Matt Prater's a veteran, so who knows, he might retire as well. But if they want to continue playing and the contract is reasonable, I'm bringing all 3 of these back. So now that I've gone through all that, here's an overview of what that leaves us with. Going into 2023, there are 28 players under contract, and depending on how things play out, I'm re-signing anywhere from 9 to 19 of those free agents, with another 16 players that I'm willing to bring to training camp. And depending on how everything plays out, that means I'm going to look to sign or draft anywhere from 8 to 17 players. There's going to be additional players signed beyond that to get to that 90-man roster for the beginning of training camp, but a lot of those are going to be undrafted free agents. So now that I've discussed the players I'm going to bring back and the players I'm going to let walk, it's time to talk about how I'm going to approach the draft and free agency. Now let's start with the draft. The Cardinals are projected to have 8 selections in the 2023 NFL Draft. They have their picks in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd round. They're projected to get a compensatory pick for losing Christian Kirk in free agency. They have their 4th round pick. They traded their 5th round pick for Cody Ford, but they do have a compensatory pick that they should get for losing Chandler Jones. And they're also projected to get a 6th round compensatory pick for losing Chase Edmonds. Now, their last pick is either going to be a 6th or 7th round pick. And the round that it ends up in is contingent on the conditions of the Trayvon Mullen trade. If he's active for at least 10 games this season, it's going to be a 6th round pick. If he's active fewer games than 10, it will be a 7th round pick. Now, he hasn't reached that threshold yet, but there are enough games left that he could. So now I want to talk about the positions I'm going to target with those draft picks. I realize there's a long time between now and the draft, and there's a lot of things that could change in terms of draft rankings, but I do want to go into the draft with a strategy for the positions I'm going to address at different spots in the draft. In round 1, I'm going to target a cornerback. I want to draft someone who's going to become a true number 1 cornerback so that we can have an outstanding tandem between him and Byron Murphy. Now, most people see Keely Ringo out of Georgia as the number 1 cornerback in this draft, but there's a chance he could be gone before the Cardinals pick. If that happens, there are some other good options out there, though. Cam Smith out of South Carolina, Brian Branch from Alabama, Jalen Jones from Texas A&M, Joey Porter Jr. at Penn State, Christian Gonzalez out of Oregon, but I'm going to try to get one of those players. Now, in round 2, I'm going to target a center. And you're probably going to be able to get either the best or second best center in the draft in the second round. Some of the players that might be options here are Luke Whippler from Ohio State, or John Michael Schmitz from Minnesota, or Cedric Van Pran from Georgia. But ultimately, I want to get that center of the future. I want to get that position locked down for the next 10 years. Now in the third round, the Cardinals have 2 picks, and I want to use that to solidify the interior defensive line. I'm going to take 1 defensive tackle and 1 defensive end. At defensive tackles, you could be looking at players like Mazi Smith from Michigan or Tyler Davis from Clemson. And at defensive end, some options include Colby Wooden from Auburn, Elijah Cansey from Pittsburgh, or Kobe Turner from Wake Forest. Then on day 3, in rounds 4 through 7, the Cardinals have 4 picks. With those 4 picks, in no particular order, I want to get a running back, a wide receiver, an offensive tackle, and then with that last pick, best player available. Maybe a safety, maybe an edge rusher, maybe a guard, maybe even a kicker or a punter. Now, I'm sure there are some fans who are asking why I didn't take an edge rusher somewhere in this draft. And that's because I want to give Cameron Thomas and Myjai Sanders a chance to be those starters. I realize our outside linebackers struggled this year, but I think you need to give those 2 young players a chance to show that they can be the guy. And if it doesn't work out, the next year, edge rusher's probably going to be one of those first picks. But for now, to address the pass rush, I'm going to let the outside linebackers, Myjai Sanders and Cameron Thomas, start and try to shore up the interior defensive line to help take some of the pressure off those outside linebackers. So now that we've talked about the draft, let's look at how I'm going to approach free agency. Now, first we have to talk about cap space. Depending on which website you look at, the Cardinals are estimated to have anywhere between $16.6 million in cap space to $22.7 million in cap space. However, when you take into account the $12 million in savings from releasing Robbie Anderson and the savings from releasing Rodney Hudson, that goes up to somewhere between $37.85 million and $43.95 million. Now, let me make a couple notes on this. First, I have designated Rodney Hudson as a post-June 1st cut. That means his cap savings is not going to be available in that first wave of free agency. So that $9.25 million in cap space saved by releasing Rodney Hudson is going to be for some of those late signings going into training camp. But that $12 million in savings from releasing Robbie Anderson will be available at the beginning of free agency. But another note to consider, based on the players I'm looking to re-sign or extend, I would anticipate at least half, if not 2/3 of that cap room is going to be dedicated to re-signing the Cardinals' own players. So while that looks like a decent chunk of cap room, you have to take into account that a lot of it is already going to be spoken for by players like Zach Allen, Byron Murphy Jr., and Will Hernandez. So with that in mind, let's look at what I'm going to prioritize in free agency. My priorities are going to be as follows. I'm going to get a starting center. Yes, I know we're drafting someone in the second round, but I want to bring in someone who can start at least for this year as a bridge to that rookie. I also want to bring in someone who can be a starting guard to replace Justin Pugh. But I also want to have a backup plan for right tackle. Moving on from Kelvin Beachum, Josh Jones is who I'm slating as that starting right tackle. Jones has played well at left tackle, but we haven't seen enough to know if he's going to be able to be that right tackle. I'm giving him a chance as a starter, but I want to have a backup plan in case it doesn't work out. Finally, I want to bring in at least one more starting interior defensive lineman. I'm bringing Zach Allen back and I'm drafting a couple players on day 2, but I want to have at least one more veteran in that room. Now I'm going to sign some other free agents, depth players, and journeyman veterans, but these are the priorities I'm going to focus on. But I also want to have some flexibility with those players I'm signing because I want to have a path to starting for some of the younger players. And if a younger player does earn a job, like for example at center, I want the player I've signed to play center to also have the flexibility to play guard if needed. So let's look at a couple players who I would likely target. First up is offensive lineman Evan Brown. Evan Brown is an offensive lineman for the Detroit Lions. Currently, he's their starting right guard. But when you look at his grades throughout his career, he's been a solid player. Not a Pro Bowl caliber player, but a solid offensive lineman. But what's particularly important to me about Evan Brown is that he has played both at center and guard. When you look at his snaps, he's played as a starting center and as a starting guard. So I'm going to bring him in to be that starting center at least until that second round pick is ready to start. And if that center earns a starting job right away, Brown can play guard and play it well. And he's also the backup center then. This gives the team a lot of flexibility in what they're going to do with that offensive line. They can draft at center, and if he's ready to play, they can find a spot for Brown somewhere else. If the center isn't ready to play, Brown can be a starting center for this team. The next player I'm going to look at is another player with similar versatility, and that is guard tackle Elijah Wilkinson of the Atlanta Falcons. Now, throughout his career, again, he's been a decent player with grades in the 60s. But again, what's noteworthy with him is he has played at both guard and tackle. So initially, I would have him as my starting left guard, but he's also my backup plan for right tackle if Josh Jones struggles. So with the positional versatility that Brown and Wilkinson offer, there's a lot of options for how to approach this offensive line. You could have your left tackle of DJ Humphries, left guard Elijah Wilkinson, center Evan Brown, right guard Will Hernandez, right tackle Josh Jones. But if that rookie center earns that starting job, you can move Evan Brown over to left guard and Elijah Wilkinson becomes your swing tackle, as well as a solid backup at guard. Or if Josh Jones struggles, you move Elijah Wilkinson over right tackle, you start someone like Lasita Smith and Marquise Hayes at left guard and have Evan Brown at center, or you play that rookie center and move Evan Brown over to left guard and keep Elijah Wilkinson at right tackle. The point here is with these two players, you have a lot of versatility, you maintain a path for that rookie center to earn that starting job, but if he's not ready, you've got someone who can start ahead of him. You have a backup plan at right tackle, but you also have room if one of those players like Marquise Hayes or Lasita Smith earns a starting job, you can shift these guys around. I think bringing in these two players provides a good balance of having players who are capable starters, but have the versatility to move around if younger players earn those starting jobs ahead of them. This is one of those ways that you build to win now, but also leave room to develop for the future. Now, on the defensive side, I still want to add a defensive lineman. Now, I know a lot of fans would like to see the Cardinals go after Daron Payne, but I think he's going to actually command a really big contract. And I'm going to look for someone who's been productive, but isn't going to be quite as pricey in terms of his contract. And the player that I'm going to target is Matt Ioannidis. Ioannidis has been a solid interior defensive lineman throughout his career. He spent most of his career with Washington, but this year he's been with the Carolina Panthers. Ioannidis also provides some flexibility. He can play that nose tackle if he needs to, but he also can play that defensive end along with Zach Allen. He's also a guy who can get after the quarterback. In 2019, his best season, he had 8.5 sacks as an interior defensive lineman. And overall, he's had 25.5 sacks throughout his career. Ioannidis can be that solid starting defensive lineman while those two players we're drafting in round 3 develop and eventually end up getting some playing time. So with all these moves, let's take a look at what the starting lineup looks like on offense and defense. First, on offense, you've got an offensive line of DJ Humphries, Elijah Wilkinson, Evan Brown, Will Hernandez, and Josh Jones, with your outside receivers of DeAndre Hopkins and Hollywood Brown, Rondale Moore in the slot, with Greg Dortch as his backup, tight end Zach Ertz, Kyler Murray at quarterback, and James Conner at halfback. Really, there's not a lot of changes here except for that offensive line where you've shored up the interior and have a new starting right tackle. And when I look at this offense with the right head coach and an offensive line that's healthy, this looks like a really good offense to me. Now with defense, we're going to look at the base alignment and the nickel. At the interior defensive line, we've got Zach Allen, Rashard Lawrence, and Matt Ioannidis. Now if JJ Watt comes back, you can add him to that, move Ioannidis inside and have Watt at defensive end. And also keep in mind there's a couple third-round picks behind these defensive linemen as depth. At outside linebacker, you have Marcus Golden and Cameron Thomas, but Myjai Sanders would be getting a lot of snaps as well. And he might even earn one of these starting jobs. At inside linebacker, you've got Zaven Collins and Isaiah Simmons. At safety, you have Jalen Thompson and Budda Baker. And then at cornerback, you have Byron Murphy Jr., and I've put Cam Smith here as that first round pick. He might not be the starter right away, but eventually you anticipate he will be. Now, when you get into the nickel, you move Ioannidis in with Allen, and then you had Hamilton as that slot cornerback. And then for depth, your fourth cornerback is Marco Wilson, a guy who started for the Cardinals the last 2 years. So if it's me, these are the kinds of moves I'm going to make to build depth, bring in young players, and field a team that I think can win in 2023. Now, I know there weren't a lot of big splash moves, but I think this fixes the Cardinals' key problems on offensive line, bringing in a #1 cornerback, and building depth on the interior defensive line. I hope you enjoyed this conversation about how I would fix the Arizona Cardinals. Let me know if there's any other players you'd look to target in free agency or the draft in the comments below. While you're at it, please be sure to click like and subscribe to my channel for more Arizona Cardinals content. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on The Cardinal Rule.